Okay, this video is going to talk about Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, and it's going to compare it or show that what goes on in the Phaedrus is what Carl Jung and archetypal psychologists call the assimilation of the shadow. Um, and so Jung defines the shadow. This is how he defines it. The shadow cast by the conscious mind of the individual contains the hidden, repressed, and unfavorable aspects of the personality. But this darkness is not just the simple converse of the conscious ego. The ego contains unfavorable and destructive attitudes, so the shadow has good qualities, normal instincts, and creative impulses. Ego and shadow, indeed, although separate, are intricately linked together in much the same way that thought and feeling are related to each other. So, what you'll see in this dialogue, it's about the union between emotion and thought. It's about eros and logos. It's about the relationship between culture and nature. And it's about, okay, so eros and logos, culture and nature, and it's also about religion and science. And Socrates is presenting a model of integrity, the integration of all of those aspects of life. Carl Jung says that when a young person comes of age, when they go through puberty and become sexually active or understand sexuality, then they are aware of their more primitive instincts, and they have to bring that to mind. They shouldn't repress it, but they have to educate those primitive instincts, which is what mythology and tragedy are trying to do. And so you awaken them, you recognize the shadow, and then you have to transform that energy into a love of wisdom, which is what all the other documents are doing. So Plato's dialogues, especially the Phaedrus, includes or focuses specifically on shadow assimilation. So what happens? Socrates is walking along, ready to talk to anybody, and he runs into Phaedrus. And Phaedrus is a young man from the aristocratic families, and he's one of the potential next generation's leaders, and he seems to be preoccupied with a speech. He's talking to himself, and Phaedrus says, "Oh, Socrates, I can use you as my audience. I'll perform for you. I'm practicing this speech." And Socrates says, "Well, I'll come with you." Phaedrus was going to go outside of the city's walls, and Socrates says, "Well, I usually don't go outside the city, but I'll come with you to talk about speeches." And Phaedrus says, "Yeah, Socrates, how come you never go outside of the city?" And he goes, "Well, I'm not interested in biology. I'm not interested in plants and animals. I'm interested in people." And that's because the city is where people develop their higher order natural capabilities, where they worry about the good life, justice, and truth, not just about mere life or economic trade. So that would make sense that Socrates in general likes the city. And then he also, they're going to go lie down in the grass, all right? And they make a lot of sex jokes, and Socrates shows that he could compete with any sophist for puns and double entente and sexually implicit and explicit language and jokes and all that sort of stuff. So Socrates gets it. He's not repressed. And then when they're about to lie down in a certain area, Socrates says, "Isn't this where the river god Boreas tried to abduct a nymph?" And Phaedrus says, "You don't believe those myths, do you?" And Socrates says, "You know what? I don't have time to worry about all this stuff. I just sort of accept it. There's too many of them to try and explain scientifically. I just want to know if what my soul is like and if it really is a typhus or what it really is. So, in that little sentence, Socrates gives you a critique of myth. On the one hand, there are the myths that try to explain natural events, and those myths have been replaced by um, science, but most of the myths are about the human psyche and they're trying to educate. So Socrates in this dialogue does not reject myth. He actually incorporates it into his holistic worldview, and he also incorporates the lessons of myths into his soul, into his psyche. He wants to learn those lessons. So anyway, they sit down, and it turns out Socrates says, you know, Phaedrus, I like you and everything, but I think you have a speech hidden in your toga there, and I'd much rather read the original than have you give me some your own little performance. No offense. And so Phaedrus pulls it out. It turns out that Lysis has written down and presented to him a seduction speech. Lysis wants to sleep with Phaedrus. Okay, so this brings up an entire tradition in Athens, a tradition of mentoring. So, young people coming of age, need an older person to mentor them, to guide them into adult life, to talk to them about their inner conflicts, about situations they get in, to give them guidance, to also talk about the human condition, about other people's behaviors, about what's going on, about the lessons of tragedy, of mythology, just about life in general. These young people, their parents were often gone running the city or going to war. So Athens had a tradition where an older man would pair with a younger man and be his mentor. Well, that makes sense. As a matter of fact, liberal education, that originally, and Plato started this, Plato's academy was partly to provide guidance and teachers for the sons of the best and the brightest whose parents were gone all the time. And so they really did need guidance. And so they would go to this school to make sure that they're learning things. Learning about life, too, not just about academic subjects. So the tradition in Athens was that they would be paired, but also that they could sleep. They would physically sleep with each other. So the relationship was this union of the physical and the intellectual, which is a really nice theory. You want to integrate the soul and the body. You want to have a whole relationship that includes all kinds of intimacy. The trouble was it wasn't working, and it was a corrupting influence. And so Plato is showing you in this dialogue why Socrates did not sleep with his students, and why that tradition in Athens that the Athenians prided themselves on as being one more aspect of why they were superior to other societies, why they were deluded about that, and it was really just a corrupting influence. So Phaedrus is clearly the catch, okay? He's the one everybody wants to sleep with, and they're competing with each other to get Phaedrus in bed with them. And so Lysis is making a speech saying, you should sleep with me because I don't love you. And Socrates, when he finds out that that was the premise, he just laughs and says, oh yeah, sure, you bet. um, he loves you as much as anybody else does. He's just trying to get a speech that will separate him from the others, and so you'll say yes to him instead of the others. But okay, so Lys's argument is that when people fall in love, it's all about pleasure, and he assumes it's about biological pleasure. It's just about sexual gratification. And when they do that, they lose their minds. They've lost their reasoning capacities. And also that they seek power relationships. So an older man falls in love with a younger man, he wants power over that young man. Whereas Lysis has it all calculated. He hasn't lost his mind. We can meet secretly at certain times, and I'm not going to brag to my friends that I got you to sleep with me. I'm not going to count, how many young men I can conquer. I'm not going to talk about conquest and all that sort of stuff. We'll just have sex and then we'll go on our merry way. And I guess my students, when they read this, they say, oh, that's friendships with benefits. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So apparently there is a tradition of this now. I've had students tell me, oh, I had some guy try to pull that one on me last week. So, okay, so Lysis says, I should not be refused what I ask simply because I'm not your lover. Lovers, when their craving is at an end, repent of such benefits as they have conferred, but for the other sort, no occasion arises for regretting what is past. So Lysis describes these relationships which make it clear that this was a horrible corrupting influence on the future leaders of Athens. So what he says is that the person is driven by sexual pleasure. He will try to control the young man, okay? First of all, he doesn't want the young man to be physically strong because the older man is losing his virility, and if the young man exercises a lot and becomes real virile and potent and aggressive, he might not be satisfied with the less aggressive sex of the older man. He also will isolate the younger man from his family and friends because he doesn't want to compete with them. He doesn't want anyone to question how virtuous and wonderful he is and what a great mentor he is. He also will want the young man to stay poor and economically dependent on him. So he will want the young man to be completely emotionally dependent on him. He doesn't want the young man to talk to other people about ideas or to develop his intellect because then he'll have to compete with that. And so he wants to make the young man physically dependent, economically dependent, emotionally dependent, intellectually dependent. So he will cripple the young man. Well, so this is what's going on. I mean, Lysis just assumes this, and so they take it for granted, which is clearly a big problem in the society. And so Socrates listens to Lysis' speech, and what's going on now is Socrates has to compete with Lysis for Phaedrus' soul. So the race is on. Socrates gives 2 more speeches to try and compete against Lysis to win over Phaedrus. Okay, so the first one, he puts a sheet over his head. He puts a cloth over his head, and he gives a speech. And he gives a speech that makes the same assumptions that Lysis' speech makes. He just defines his terms and the speech is more systematic. It's a better speech in terms of understanding the subject matter and the claim that you want to make. So Socrates says that when irrational desire pursuing the enjoyment of beauty has gained the mastery over judgment that prompts to right conduct, it is the strong passion called love. Now a man who's dominated by desire and enslaved to pleasure is of course bound to aim at getting the greatest possible pleasure out of his beloved, and what pleases a sick man is anything that does not thwart him, whereas anything that is as strong as or stronger than himself gives him offense. Hence he will not, if he can avoid it, put up with a favorite that matches or outdoes him in strength, but will always seek to make him weaker and feebler. All of those defects of mind and more in the beloved are bound to be a source of pleasure to the lover, and he will cultivate them. And so there is this assumption that desire is physical, it's instinctual, and it cannot be transformed. It is completely at odds with reason, which again is not what Jung says and not what the myths say. Obviously, the intellectual elite in Athens have developed these assumptions about the human psyche that fly in the face of all the lessons, all the worldview that underlies Greek myth, Homer, and tragedy. And they don't even know it. They don't seem to know that they've basically shredded their educational institutions, their moral educational system. And they did it by saying, oh, that's all myth and it's against science. We are instinctual beings, and we have a superego, an ego, and an id. The id is the drive for pleasure, and the superego is reasoning, and it has to keep a lid on pleasure. They're always at odds. But that is not what goes on in their tradition. So they've rejected it, and they've come up with this much more shallow view, superficial view of human nature and the human condition. So after Socrates gives that speech, he says, now wasn't that a better organized speech than Lys's? And Phaedrus sort of has to admit it. But then Socrates takes off the veil and he says, wait a second. False is the tale that when a lover is at hand, favor ought rather to be accorded to one who does not love, on the ground that the former is mad and the latter of sound mind. That would be right if it were an invariable truth that madness is an evil, but in reality the greatest blessings come by way of madness, indeed of madness that is heaven sent. And that's of course consistent with the myths. And so Socrates then, that's the first third of the dialogue, is Socrates versus Lysis in trying to compete for Phaedrus' soul. And then Socrates gives his own seduction speech. So first, his first speech is to acknowledge that he knows what Lysis is saying, and now he's going to reject it, and he's going to give a speech that seduces Phaedrus into preferring him. Now at the end of the speech, 2/3 of the way into the dialogue, Socrates says, well, you shouldn't take the whole thing literally. I was trying to please Phaedrus and use my imagination because Phaedrus is pleased by such images. So when scholars take this literally, it's kind of crazy because Socrates himself says, yeah, I have used imaginary language, shouldn't take it literally. Then also later on in the dialogue he says, the dialectician understands the type of human soul and the type of human speech, and when he's in the presence of a certain person, he figures out what type of soul that is, and he uses the kind of speech that will be persuasive to that person and try to persuade them to seek wisdom and to engage in dialectic, which is the training of nous, the mind. So obviously that's what Socrates has done in his myth in the middle of the Phaedrus. But scholars read it literally. They read this as one of the dialogues that portrays Socrates' belief in the forms, that our souls were exposed to the forms in some prenatal existence, which is, first, it's just, okay, the one reason he's obviously used language, he's acting as a dialectician. And the other sort of outrageous thing is that Socrates says in the Apology the only thing that distinguishes him is he doesn't think he knows what he doesn't know. And nobody knows if there's a prenatal existence or anything like that. So Socrates, of course, would not claim to know that. So this is not a belief that Plato or Socrates have. Um, Plato is using mythological language in exactly the same way the people who created the myths and the tragedies and Homer used it. The gods are personifications of the powers of the human soul, and the point of a myth is to try to educate those powers, including recognizing the dark side and flushing it out and motivating people to love wisdom. So, why is it that scholars do read it literally? Well, I think the reason is because ever since the Enlightenment, we're supposed, the training of the best and the brightest, what you get rewarded for is scientific reasoning, which involves looking at things literally and reading things literally. And that's not the way the Greek educational system worked. And so I read Plato as if he is responding to the system he grew up in, that he understands its educational purpose, that he agrees with it, but it no longer has, that the Athenians themselves lost their understanding of it. They either consciously gave it up or else they thought they were agreeing with it. It was a corrupting influence. And so he shows how he needed to create a different set of words to lead to the same education of the powers of soul. There's the same goal, developing the love of wisdom, but he needed to create this character, Socrates, who says he's living the life of the mind, so you can trust that Socrates is doing the right thing and figure out why. And also that he has to prioritize the myths. He has to re-explain them in a new kind of language because it's ossifying in it. The previous tradition is being rejected or misunderstood. So what he does, though, is after he says, false is the tale that madness is a bad thing, he categorizes all these kinds of divine madness. So the Delphic oracle, for example, the Pythia sits on the tripod and she breathes in fumes and she goes into a trance, and then that's the message from the gods in Hades, and then the priests interpret that message. Okay, so that's one kind of madness, divine madness. And there's the Dionysian frenzies, the kind of ecstatic dances of the followers of Dionysus. There's the Artemis, the woodswoman. There's a certain kind of dancing, crazy ecstatic dancing that the followers of Artemis engage in. There's just lots of kinds of divine madness in Greek culture. And so Socrates categorizes that, and he doesn't demonize it, but he does he invents his own myth. And he creates this image. One of the images that he creates is this image of the soul as three parts, having a charioteer and two horses. And he says, let the soul be likened to the union of powers in a team of winged steeds and their winged charioteer. With us, human beings, it is a pair of steeds that the charioteer controls. One of them is noble and good, and of good stock, while the other has the opposite character, and its stock is the opposite. Okay, so this corresponds to Jung, saying there's a golden shadow and a dark shadow, and the point of shadow assimilation is to take those energies of the dark shadow and to transform them into a passion for truth, justice, beauty. That's what myth tries to do in tragedy, because it shows you the horrors of following through on those awful dark emotions, all the destruction. So you and the horrors of just being well intentioned but ignorant. So you want a passion for wisdom. You want constantly be seeking wisdom. So Socrates gives this image, and he presents this image in a very emotional way. It's very long. He tells a story of reigning in the dark shadows. So, first of all, his myth starts out with the soul is immortal, and it's gone through many incarnations, and it saw an immortal world before it came into this world. It was exposed to this world of forms, and it saw these forms, and then it got connected to a body, came back to earth, and it has to now, the charioteer has to rein in that dark side and transform it. So that prenatal existence, okay, the horses are in the golden field, so there's grass, right? Exactly like they're lying in the grass. And so he's talking about this grass, this wonderful field in the other world, the previous world. And then some of the charioteers had more control over their horse, their dark horse, and those souls were able to look at the forms for a long time, and it imprinted itself on the back of their minds. And then other ones, the dark horse was pretty wild, and they only got a little glimpse of the forms. And so then when they came back to earth and were embodied, some souls have a better grip on the forms, they're wiser, and some of them are more wild and more dedicated to physical pleasure. So, and then later on in the Republic, Plato just says, nous is a natural power. We're born with the capacity for these different powers, and a correct education activates those powers and educates those powers. So there's no need for a prenatal existence or any of this mythology. But it is a good mythological explanation for what Socrates wants to get Phaedrus to do, which is to start talking to him about justice. So what happens? He says, okay, when the souls come back to the earth, the ones who saw the most, right? And Phaedrus wants to be flattered. He wants to flatter himself. He wants to be the best. They are lovers of Zeus, and an old person who has loved Zeus and lived a life of justice will seek out a young man who has that kind of soul, who was exposed, and who seeks justice. And then one who didn't have quite as much time to look at the forms will be a lover of honor, and then there's Aries, and then there's the whole list. So Plato creates a hierarchy of the gods, so they aren't all the same. Some of them are more important than others, with Zeus being at the top. And then he also he's trying to seduce Phaedrus, right? He wants Phaedrus to love him, to be attracted to him, and to engage in what Jung called transference. So Jung said, if you really want a meaningful therapeutic relationship between what he calls the analyst and the analsand, or the one who's analyzed, the one who comes needing help has to project, the analyst has to be a mature person, have a complete integrity, have to be wise. And so the person who's suffering projects onto that person. And the analyst should know how to ask good questions, should know how to draw the person out, should know how to stimulate their love of wisdom and their desire for integrity and wholeness. And it's difficult, but the young person has to really project into the older person and has to believe that they can develop that kind of integrity. So that's the mentor-mentee relationship the way it should be. And Socrates says this. He says, "Thus the followers of Zeus seek a beloved who is Zeus-like in soul. Wherefore they look for one who is by nature disposed to the love of wisdom and the leading of men, and when they have found him and come to love him, they do all in their power to foster this disposition." And that's where in the previous video, James Hillman said that Socrates thought all education is tied to eros, to the daimon eros, and the love of wisdom. And he says this here in the Phaedrus. And also, he describes these relationships as so emotionally satisfying and educational that he's really trying to convince Phaedrus, if Phaedrus wants to be happy, if he wants to grow up, if he wants to have integrity as an adult, he should go with Socrates, not with Lysis. So he says, "And now that he has come to welcome his lover and to take pleasure in his company and conversation, it comes home to him what a depth of kindliness he has found. So he loves, and knows not what he loves. He does not understand. He cannot tell what has come upon him. His lover is, as it were, a mirror in which he beholds himself." So, the wise mentor is supposed to set an example of a life well lived, and the young man projects into that older man and wants to anticipate, wants to imagine that he can become like that. But he needs this mentoring relationship, and it's based on trust and goodwill. And so that's why Socrates did not sleep with his students. Socrates tried to create this kind of bond with all the best and brightest young men in Athens, particularly the ones that had the most capacity, the smartest, the most, charismatic, because they had power, and they could use that power either to lead Athens toward wisdom and justice and being a self-governing city, or they could, if they sought power or they sought wealth, they could drive Athens into trying to build a military empire or into economic conquest and really destroy the city. So Socrates always tried to bond with those young men and try to teach them to love justice. So that's what happens in the center part of the dialogue. And Socrates presents this huge, beautiful myth. And it's not supposed to be taken literally, but it's very much an educational tool, and it works on Phaedrus pretty well. It seems to work, let's put it that way. He says, "Boy, Socrates, that was a really good speech. And Lysis is going to take quite a bit of work for him to come back with something better." So obviously they're in a competition. It's like a boxing match. Okay, you really punched Lysis, gave him a left, or whatever it is. And he had a takedown, but I'll go to him with his talking to him about your speech, and then he can see what he can come up with. So Phaedrus still hasn't gotten it, right? He didn't really get that he should just say, Phaedrus is never going to get there. Phaedrus doesn't get it. And if I want to love wisdom, I'm going to have to stay with Socrates. But Phaedrus didn't get that. He's still in this mode of competition. So this follows the pattern in Plato's dialogues, which I'll talk about later. They're divided into thirds. In the first third, they have all the assumptions of the cave. Human beings are by nature irrational. In the middle third, they turn around. They start with a different archetype, a different assumption, a different first principle. And the first principle there is that human beings by nature seek wisdom. And that's what the mythological language was trying to convey and to educate. And Plato invents his own set of myths to replace the old ones, to try and trigger the love of wisdom. And then in the third, and Phaedrus doesn't get it. So 2/3 of the way through is the peak of the dialogue. The interlocutor doesn't get it, but the reader can get it, okay? The reader is supposed to get what the interlocutor didn't get. And they're supposed to know there's a lot at stake. Athens fell partly because of this corruption of the educational system. So it matters, okay? You should be scared. You should say, okay, I can identify with that. I understand. I have empathy with these characters. But I'm afraid, like, I could make those mistakes. I could get seduced. I could split off religion and science and not learn any of the lessons of the myth. I could, prefer being entertained to being educated. I could care more about sex than about learning. I'm capable of this, and I should not, don't do it. You destroy your city. Do not deny that that kind of personal behavior undermines social stability and coherence. It creates the need for a more authoritarian society. It destroys everything that makes life worth living. So don't do it. Okay, so in the third section, they go back to discussing logos and rhetoric. And Phaedrus says, okay, he brings up Gorgias. Gorgias says that you don't really have to know anything about your subject matter in order to write a persuasive speech about it. And in the Gorgias dialogue, he says that. He says, I have more power than a doctor, because a doctor might know what kind of medicine a person needs, but he can't persuade the person to take the medicine. I, on the other hand, the guy who can write persuasive speeches, can persuade him to take the medicine. So I have more power than the doctor. Well, Socrates says, do you teach your students about virtue and justice so that when they get this tool for exercising power, they use it to promote justice and virtue and wisdom? And Gorgias says, well, I don't know. I didn't think it was that important. Sure, they all learn that kind of stuff. I give them the tool they really need. And of course, that's an incredible corrupting influence. But Phaedrus is caught up with that too. He's enamored of what the sophists teach, persuasion, the art of persuasion. That's why he's kind of shocked that Lysis is a specialist in speech writing, and yet Socrates wrote a better speech. So, hey, Lysis, you better come back. This is your profession, so you better be able to beat out this lowly stonecutter here. Anyway, so they talk about speech and the power of speech and the corruption of speech. And it's clear that there's two different patterns in the way people use speech. So the sophists teach the power of persuasion and assume that the students will use it to gain money, power, and status. And the sophist himself uses his tool of teaching rhetoric to gain money, power, and status. And so they assume that's what human beings by nature desire. And so they're incredibly good people and good at what they do, because they give young people the tool to be able to get what makes life worth living. Of course, that's not what Socrates thinks. So you have two roads. That's the low road, the assumption people are irrational by nature. Socrates represents the high road, the assumption that people by nature seek wisdom, and they will never have integrity. They will never be able to unify conscious and unconscious and live a complete, flourishing human life unless they do love wisdom and they're committed to that and they're passionate about it. And then toward the end, Socrates talks about the dialectician who identifies the kind of soul, selects a certain kind of soul, and speaks to that soul in a certain language to try and turn it around from the cave to the light. Try to turn it from seeking irrational goals to loving wisdom. And then later than that, he says that the written word is not worth very much because anybody can write down anything and other people misinterpret it. So people, just like when people are in conversation, they engage in this transference, projection. They project themselves onto the other person because a young person doesn't even know himself. So he needs to do that transference. But other people project, like they take the evil inside of them and blame it on somebody else. Like the Athenians blamed Socrates for their collapse. They wanted to find someone else to blame. They didn't want to blame themselves. So there's this projection. And so what happens in the written word, it gets in the hands of the wrong people, and they use it to justify their own state of soul. So people do that with Plato. They either want to believe that they're educated and they like Plato, and so they project onto it and say Plato says XYZ and I happen to agree with it. Or they decide they want to be anti-Plato. Plato is anti-science or something, and so they will project that and they'll condemn Plato. Or, I mean, ever since, it's been a long time that people have been reading Plato, and so obviously Plato has been interpreted in any number of ways, and that's because of this problem of the written word, as Plato says. He says the real dialogue is in the soul of the person, which is why I present these videos, that somebody would know that if I were talking to somebody, I am just a certain kind of person and I engage in certain kind of dialogues, or I would if I could. I'm very isolated in rural Arkansas. But it really, the dialogue is inside of you. The thought is an inner dialogue of the soul with itself. And these dialogues also get played out, that people talk to each other in these sorts of dialogues that Plato's dialogues represent, and that what they say and what they think made all the difference to whether intellectual and political freedom were preserved or destroyed. So the stakes are really high, and it's very important that people integrate the shadow, that they don't project it, that they become passionate lovers of wisdom and virtue and justice, because it means they have to go over and beyond. They have to constantly be making efforts and that require stamina, dedication, because it's very easy just to try to get by, but the city can't survive if people are dissipated, lazy, and then also if they're greedy or power hungry. So all of these things really matter. And Jung thought they mattered in his day, 20th century, and Plato thought they mattered in his time. So this particular video is about the Phaedo and the assimilation of the shadow in the life of a young person. And the next video is going to be about the symposium and another big theme in Jungian psychology, which is men and women have, each of them have a male principle and a female energies, of psychic energies. The male is the more aggressive, the female is the more nurturing. This is like yin and yang. It's not as if the Greeks invented this. And in the symposium, we're talking about how the men and how Socrates relate to the creative, erotic side of life.